device, and today we're going to focus on the software and electronics. And I'll introduce now Geoff Sizer, the CEO of Genesys Electronics Design. Hello, Geoff.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks everybody for the opportunity to speak with you today.
And the style of presentations we have is what we call a radio interview. So as your host, I will be basically interviewing Geoff, and we'll be using the slides as talking points. But throughout the presentation, I will be interjecting and asking questions on your behalf, but I'd love to hear your questions at the end. So with that, I'll hand over to Geoff to start the presentation.
So in terms of what is an active medical device, it is discriminated from other sorts of medical device by the fact that it has a power source. It's powered by electricity of some sort. That may be connection to a mains derived source, or it may be a battery, but it's effectively the discriminating characteristic. And of course, in this day and age, most active medical devices will have in them electronics of some sort, typically microcontroller, hosting software, and other sorts of electronic circuits to allow the device to perform its function. This slide just gives you an example of some active medical devices that Genesys has been involved in developing, ranging from a diagnostic screening device for cervical cancer through to a dye injector used in operating theatres, hand trauma therapy, exercising machine, and the one in the bottom right-hand corner is quite interesting. Monitoring elderly people in their home, you can ask the question, is that a medical device or not? And the answer is the use case. If it's simply used for monitoring by nearest and dearest loved ones of the elderly person's general health and well-being, you would argue it's not a medical device. But if you use such a system, for example, in an old folks' home for monitoring the well-being of people, then it could be classed as a medical device. I'll be keeping today's presentation fairly informal, and I'll be relying on Tim to interject at the appropriate time to ask for discussions and clarifications. This slide is a very rough pictorial representation of the roles of the key development resources and activities involved in developing an active medical device. So it shows at the start you typically involve an industrial designer who would assist you with the packaging of the device, what it's going to look like, so forth and so forth. Then increasing the role through the development process will be electronics and software resources, starting off in the early stages with defining requirements and then building that role through the development process, developing the electronic circuit boards and also the software that runs on them.
So Geoff, can I just ask a question there? It seems to imply that the industrial designer is I guess the first point of call. Is that always the case with medical devices, or are there scenarios where the electronics and software consultant would be the first port of call?
It really depends on the nature of the device. At the extreme, there is software as a medical device, where the entire medical device is the software. You still may involve an industrial designer to assist with, for example, the user interface, the look and feel, but it's going to be a low-key role. At the other extreme, you might have a device, take for an example, an electronically controlled bed in a hospital, where it's very much an industrial mechanical item where the electronics and software plays perhaps a secondary role. So that's a roundabout way of saying that it depends very heavily on the nature of the device and what it's used for. But typically, most people like to think of things as a product, and they want to know what it looks like and what it feels like. So the industrial design is extremely important. The electronics in the early stages is just making sure that the electronics components and circuitry can fit within inside the device, the user interface is accessible and so forth. But the industrial designer would take the initial lead, but then the electronics and software comes into their own. At the extreme, if it's an active device where the industrial design is just packaging, just a case, then the electronics designers have a much bigger role to play.
And I think this diagram is a little bit misleading in the sense that these little radio buttons down the bottom here, you have regulatory approval right at the end. My understanding that's, it's obviously a final step, but regulatory starts right from the start, doesn't it?
Yeah, the regulatory compliance process should start right at the beginning in preparation for that regulatory approval. And in a circumstance where you are using ISO 13485 certified developers, which is always a wise move when you're developing an active medical device, those organisations will typically be deeply enmeshed in regulatory approval preparations from day one, and the role of the medical device manufacturer who releases it to the market may be relatively small at the start, but then culminates in a regulatory approval process. So to answer your question, the regulatory approval considerations carry on throughout the entire development process.
Yeah, and look, I'm just aware of being bandying around this word ISO 13485, just for anybody who missed the earlier webinars. That is a quality management standard that any company that's marketing or was the official owner or what they call a product sponsor of a medical device must have in place. And you made the comment that ideally their suppliers, the designers and the manufacturers would also have 13485. So you, as a product developer, you need to be a 13485 certified business yourself. But if ideally, if you're an industrial designer, your electronics designer and your electronics manufacturer will also 13485 certified, it just makes the whole process easier, doesn't it?
I'll be touching briefly on the regulatory standards today, hopefully not to the extent of boring everybody. Each of those standards that I'll be identifying in their own right deserve a full webinar at least to do more than just scratch the surface. So apologies for the emphasis on the regulatory compliance aspects, but they really are a key to the process, and they are what discriminates between developing and manufacturing a commercial or industrial product vis-a-vis a medical product. So that is really the driving force for the emphasis on the medical regulatory aspects.
Okay. So this is a 101 slide, which I insisted that you put in, just in case people didn't actually know what electronics were really all about. The rest of the webinar is going to be talking more about the regulatory side of things. But I might talk to this slide and just get you to make any comments. If when you knock on the door and walk into the office of any kind of electronics designer, the first thing they're going to want to do is really pin down exactly what it is that you build, and that starts with user needs, but very rapidly comes to a document called the system specification that sets out what exactly it is that you're going to build. When you press a button, it does X, Y, and Z, and simply put, but all the functions and features of the device that you want it to do are going to be spelled out in the system specification. That then gets translated into an engineering design with block diagrams and concepts about how we're going to translate the requirements into an actual engineered system. And then for electronics, and that is true for any engineering, any kind of engineered system. But when you move into electronics, basically the first thing you do is you write out circuit schematics, what resistors are going to go where, what capacitors, what microprocessors, what antenna, and all that sort of thing. That translates into and actually you can then go to a PCB layout, and you can see on those images on the right, on the top right-hand corner is a piece of software called Altium that you actually do the design. It translates into a rendered image of what the 3D, what a circuit board would look like and how it lays out. And then finally, you output that into a manufacturing package, which includes things like the bill of materials, what components the manufacturer needs to purchase in order to make it. It also includes what we call Gerber files, which is if the board has several layers, and it'll have a different, essentially a photographic method for printing the, the various layers of the board. And then finally, you get as you see in the bottom right-hand corner, the manufacturer is then able to make a printed circuit board that plugs in to your device, and it's often the hidden part of the device. It's inside the box. You really can't see it. And actually, Geoff, it's quite frustrating for electronics designers because people see the pretty shiny outside of it and the mechanicals and the user interface, but the beating heart of any active medical device is the circuit board. Do you want to elaborate on anything I said there?
Yeah, indeed. The circuit board will typically have a microcontroller on it that hosts the software, and that is what makes the device actually work. So I have been known to make disparaging comments about industrial designers design a box and we actually make the thing work. It's a little bit oversimplistic, but to a degree, the role of the electronics and the software in medical devices is hidden, and it can be grossly misunderstood in terms of what significance that is in terms of the overall development cost effort for the device. You may have 10% of the cost is associated with the industrial design, and 90% of the cost might be associated with the electronics and software, or a device doesn't have a complicated mechanical function. Conversely, you may have active mechanisms where the electronics is a relatively small part of the overall development costs, but nevertheless, the device won't work without it.
Okay, let's move on then. So this is a fairly daunting diagram. Can you explain why we need it, Geoff?
Yeah, I've put this diagram up as a basis to just talk about the various steps that are required in designing and specifying, designing and developing an active medical device. This could in fact be applied to a non-medical device, but this is an example of a real project that we've done with a teaming partner, Design and Industry, for a medical device development for a relatively simple device. So it shows a timeline and the activities undertaken within the industrial design domain and the electronics and software domain, which are similar in principle and can follow gated stages, but the detail of the activities of each of the parties do differ along the way. So I'll just focus on the electronics and software pathway just in overview. So at the start, we have user needs capture. What does the device need to do for the end user, and also considerations of other stakeholders in the process. You'll note that each of these steps is separated by a review, and that is a requirement of the medical regulatory standards that when you do anything before you proceed to the next step, you review the outputs of the previous step. So following on from capturing the needs, we will go through a process of identifying solutions. There's no point in fully defining a device that you can't actually implement, so you need to have some idea of the solutions. In this particular project, we needed to produce a proof of concept. So it was something to show to the end-use customer who had commissioned our services for this project to prove that the device actually could usefully do what was needed to be done in a manner that you could convey to stakeholders. So it's very much a case of a very early step to develop a proof of concept of a functioning device. I know of cases where companies make the mistake of focusing very heavily on the proof of concept and thinking that's a done deal. Get to the end of the proof of concept stage and think, okay, let's manufacture it and put it in the market. Well, really, it can be as extreme as that proof of concept then gets consigned to the garbage bin and you then get on with the actual full development job. So after the proof of concept in this instance, we've learnt a lot by producing that. So we can then go into the capturing of design inputs. So that is the term that's in common usage in the medical domain for the specification for the device, what it is or what it does. Most important single document produced in the project will be that capture of the design input requirements in terms of specifications for the electronics, mechanical and software items in the product. So having got those deliverables from that capturing of design inputs approved and everyone in agreement, we can then launch into the development. So the electronics pathway follows circuit schematic capture for the circuit board, followed by prototyping of the PCB. Printed circuit assembly is the printed circuit board with the components attached to it. In parallel with that, we will be developing software to run on a platform. The software is then integrated with the electronics prototype hardware, going through verification. Well, verification is confirming that the device conforms to its specified requirements. And in parallel with that, the industrial designers will be undertaking their part of the process shown on the top pathway. We then move into a pilot production stage where the verified design is transferred across to the electronics manufacturer, who will do a pilot run of electronics prototypes. And in parallel with that, the industrial designers will be organising tooling of the injection moulded plastic parts or of mechanical manufactured parts. That all comes together at a point where we have a complete working functional device integrated with software, and that can then move into the release stage. What I haven't shown on this slide are the medical regulatory activities that follow that in terms of verification and validation of the total design. So really the end point of this is when we're actually ready to move into the manufacturing stage, but we have to do all of the regulatory compliance stuff.
Geoff, you mentioned earlier that electronics, normal electronics devices, or we often call Internet of Things devices these days, the only difference is the regulatory side of things. To what extent, what are the main differences, and how much does it add to the cost and the timeline for a project?
I'd like to answer that question by saying that a medical device development of an active medical device is very little different from applying a best practice approach to designing any electronic device. So the actual design and development process, if you are applying best practice to that design, there is not a lot of difference. Where the differences do come in are some additional rigours that the medical regulations require. One of the key ones is risk management, that I'll talk about briefly. And the other is just generally a process of making sure that everything is defined, everything is documented, and that a complete record is maintained of the whole process, which generally for a non-medical device, that's done in a minimalistic manner, but for medical device, it's a fairly significant impost.
Because what I often hear is people, with this idea of minimum viable product in mind, say, look, let's not do the first version of the device using medical regulatory standards. Let's just get something to market to show investors and prove that the thing can actually work. We'll worry about the regulatory stuff later. What do you say to that?
Well, if it's a medical device and your minimum viable product is a medical device, you cannot do that legally.
Yeah.
Bottom line is, for medical device must be done under the controls of ISO 13485's quality system. Yeah. That requires the application of design controls, which is probably a very good segue into the next slide.
Okay.
What is design control? It's effectively the process that you apply to make sure that the developments are done in accordance with the planned process and that everything is documented and recorded. The little diagram on the right-hand side is a very useful diagram. You won't, in fact, find this in any of the regulatory compliance standards. It appears in FDA, from US FDA guidelines, and it has its origins back in a report done by the Canadian authorities. It has, however, entered the vernacular as the process for pathway to develop a medical product. So the little boxes show user needs feeding into design inputs, which are the specification documents feeding into the design process, actually designing and developing the device. Design outputs are the prototypes and the documentation arising from that, ultimately yielding a medical device. So you see throughout the process we apply review, we then have a verification, and there's a feedback loop. If you verify your design outputs and find some deficiencies, you cycle back through the design input and design process to rectify them, and ultimately the medical device goes through validation. Terms verification and validation require some explanation. Very simplistically, verification says, does the device do what its specification says it should do? Validation is, does the medical device do what the user needs it to do? So the difference between the two, you can of course have a flaw in your specification. So the device meets specification, but doesn't actually do what the user needs it to do. It's a very simplistic view, but nevertheless a very useful one about the differences.
I assume that means that there would be that would have resulted from an error between translating the user needs into the design inputs.
Translating user needs to the design inputs, and indeed the user needs may be deficient in themselves. Something vital may have been left out of the user need, that once you've got your medical device and you're validating it, you say, oh, oops, really doesn't do that. Well, we forgot to put that in the user needs. One very important concept throughout this whole little cascading flow diagram is the concept of traceability. So every aspect of that medical device, you must be able to trace that back to a user need and through the intermediate steps in the process. So just to close the loop on what are design controls are effectively the method by which you implement this process and along the way make sure that everything is documented, documents are recorded and preserved, and that everything is reviewed and signed off by the stakeholders at every step in the process.
Why is having all that records of user needs right through to the final product, why do you need all of that for a medical device?
Well, probably the simplistic answer is because the regulations say you must.
Yes.
ISO 12485 says you must follow this process and you cannot apply it retrospectively. So you can't get to the end and say, oh, let's do our regulatory compliance documentation. It simply doesn't work. And particularly for software, because the standard IEC 6304 that applies to software specifically describes that you must do these processes along the way. You can't retrospectively apply them. So anyone who tries to do so will find themselves in a world of pain.
One of the things, when I was listening to you then, the impression I got is that, particularly when you thought about, oops, you might have left something out of the user needs or it didn't get translated properly, is the need for absolute rigor. And, I've seen these kind of workshops in actions and they can be quite painful in the level of detail they go into and looking at something from 10 different angles to make sure you've left nothing out. But I guess the regulatory requirements, it's all trying to enforce what just they know from best practice needs to be done.
Absolutely, and you strive at every point to do things as well as you can at that time. But having said that, this process does allow for iteration. It's actually got iteration built into it. So I would say in a typical project I've been involved with, you would do the best you can to capture the user needs. But in crafting the design inputs, you put in things that you know that need to be there as a competent designer. And you often, in fact, almost always would find design inputs that don't actually marry up very well to a user need. So you then go back and say, well, we need a user need that links to that design input. And it might be something as simplistic as, the design input, it needs to have a regulated power supply that meets a certain regulatory standard. And then the user need that couples to that is that the device has to be used in certain countries and meet the requirements of their local mains power systems. So you will certainly have iteration throughout this process, but you try and minimise that because the further down the track you get, if you have to circle back, the more work and pain that causes.
Yeah, and a typical entrepreneur who's thinking, I'd like to make a device, might not be thinking about the different, power, regulations in different countries and so forth. So you need a lot of interaction between the electronics designer and the entrepreneur.
Absolutely, the entrepreneur doesn't really want to concern themselves with that detail, and nor should they. They should be reliant on experts who have that knowledge and take it as written that the experts are providing the appropriate information they need and not leaving stuff out just because they, as an entrepreneur, didn't raise it as a requirement. It's the obligation on the developer and the designer to actually provide value add by addressing those aspects.
Okay, let's move on then.
So this is just a snapshot of the headline regulatory compliance standards that any developer of an active medical device will encounter. So the ones at the top are probably the two headline ones, ISO 13485 that we've mentioned, which applies to the quality management system. For those familiar with ISO 9001, this is effectively 9001 on steroids. It takes 9001 and adds to it a whole heap of extra stuff specific to medical. The hand in hand with that is ISO 14971 for risk management. I won't go into any of the details of that today, but it does couple very closely with 13485. So those are the headline standards that the device must follow. Sitting under that, IEC 60601-1 is the Bible for safety of electromedical devices. Not be deceived, there is a lot more to it than just electrical safety, but it is for an electrical device. Next to that, we have 6304, which is the companion standard that applies to the software that goes into an active medical device with software on it, which is nearly all of them. And the third headline standard there is usability, which is quite important. And you will come across many other standards that are specific to the particular type of medical device. These will include aspects such as sterility, packaging, mechanical robustness, and there are some very product-specific standards that might apply to a wheelchair or a bed in a hospital or a therapeutic or diagnostic device. I know Tim's revving me up and moving me along here, so here's just really a little bit more detail on those particular slides. Anyone who is contemplating developing that medical device, I would strongly recommend that you become familiar with these standards and at least know they exist and what they mean. If, for example, you're applying for venture capital and you're going to have your business case scrutinised by a knowledgeable buyer, or if you are engaging in grant funding and applying for grants of any sort, rest assured that your application will receive a lot of scrutiny from the point of view of what your proposals and propositions and pathways are to achieve compliance with these standards. If you find that incredibly daunting, don't know where to start, my recommendation is to consult with an expert. Tim, I think you want to wrap up reasonably soon on the detail, so we perhaps won't labour on the point, but I will address ISO 13485. We have a webinar coming up very shortly, specifically on the topic. Might even be the next one.
Yes, it is, yeah.
The next webinar will address ISO 13485 in detail about what's required to establish a quality management system that achieves compliance with this. So the dot points, they were really only there for the record. I won't talk to them. Let's flip to the next one. 14971 likewise. We will certainly have in due course a specific webinar on how to deal with risk management. It's an extremely significant and daunting topic and is probably the biggest signal area that an experienced electronics and software developer may not have come to grips with, and it will require an extension of their capabilities to be able to deal with this within the context of active medical device development.
Can I ask what makes it daunting?
It's a very rigorous process, and it's something that a good electronics designer will consider risk, but they won't do it to the level of rigor that's required to satisfy the requirements. So this is it's a very well-written standard and easy to follow, but it is extremely high protein in its content. Probably the single biggest challenge is how do you go about dealing with the second dot point? What is the risk of the medical device? How do you identify harms to the patient and hazardous situations that can cause those harms? And how do you then go about reducing risk to an acceptable level? This is a big ticket item for the electronics hardware, and in fact, the overall device, including all of its functions. It is a very big ticket item for the software. So software development under IEC 6304 specifically has ISO 14971 risk management called up. So it's really, we're now delving into the domains that will challenge anyone who's used to developing electronics and software for a commercial device. Is another layer of rigor and another skill set that needs to be applied over and above simply designing electronics and software that works.
Okay, let's move on.
So IEC 60601-1, it's about 600-page long standard and can be considered quite daunting, but it's very broad in its application, and you'll find that most devices, only a relatively small subset of it actually does apply to their device. But there are some key aspects that do, and you'll note that the usability I've mentioned in software get called up by this standard. So it's the headline standard that does call up those other standards. Electromagnetic compatibility, many people will be familiar with that because that does apply to commercial devices. Then there are other specific areas, for example, sterility and biohazards may not apply to all devices. So in summary, this is a very comprehensive and rigorous standard. Many people find it daunting, but it's actually not that difficult if you take a systematic approach and are not daunted by the size and scope of it. It's not actually that difficult to comply with, but it does require a very orderly and rigorous and systematic approach.
Okay.
6304 applies specifically to the software, and it is a life cycle standard, so it applies from the very start of your software through to completion. The three classes roughly align with the medical device class. So Class A software for a Class 1 medical device, Class B software for a Class 2 medical device, Class C software for maybe a Class 2B medical device or a Class 3 medical device. So there's a reasonable alignment. And that the sections of the standard that apply with increasing rigor to the different software classes. So Class A, many of the clauses of 6304 simply don't apply. Class A is where the software can't possibly contribute to causing harm to anybody. So the items addressed basically in order that you apply them: capturing requirements. Defining a software architecture is something that is not often done by software designers, and they actually should. Any software should have a well-defined architecture. Coding typically needs to be done to a particular standard, and there are requirements for coding reviews. What I haven't highlighted on this slide is the need to decompose the software and its architecture into software units, which are its component parts. Make sure that those software units are tested separately from the overall integrated software suite. So it's not a simple case as designing all your software, switching the device on and seeing if it works. You actually have to delve under the hood and test each software component part against its application's programming interface and its specification. Then following through the process we have formal verification, and I've mentioned here the units. They need to be verified at the software unit level. Then it's an integrated system. You need to have configuration control and change control over your software. And finally, you have a formal process for software maintenance. So if the software is in the field and bugs crop up, they need to be assessed for their risk component, and that risk needs to be managed. And you need to have a formal process for verifying any software changes, bug fixes, or capability enhancements, and doing regression testing to make sure that the implementation of that new software hasn't broken anything.
Geoff, can I just ask, what I think is a very important question at this stage, because, what you said just then, I'm sure is absolutely important. But if I was an entrepreneur who had this idea for a bit of, some sort of device that's going to, really neat idea and I need a bit of electronics, their head may be hurting at this stage, thinking, why do I need to know all about this? Can't I just leave that to the designer to do it? So let me ask the question, for the members of the audience who might be sitting there saying, why do I need to know this? How does an entrepreneur typically interact with the designer? What do they need to know? And in the design phase and also in the process of releasing it and getting it to manufacture?
Well, I think the entrepreneur needs to be an informed buyer, so they need to know enough to know who to talk to and the fact that the people they're talking to are giving them honest advice. But beyond that, you can delegate responsibility for the understanding of all of this stuff to suppliers who know how to do it. The medical standards are interesting in that you can't actually delegate responsibility, you can only delegate work. But in the early stages, I would strongly commend you to rely upon trusted suppliers to deal with the detail of this. as you progress down the path, build your knowledge base to a sufficient level that when you ultimately become a medical device manufacturer, you have people on your team that know enough about this stuff that they are comfortable in carrying it forward beyond the engagement of the developers. But during the development process, if you have a trusted supplier who has this knowledge, you can rely upon them to deal with all of this detail.
So when you talk about being an informed buyer, are you expecting the entrepreneur to become a expert in different aspects of coding standards of what, or would you recommend that they actually hire somebody in their team who has sufficient technical knowledge to have those sensible conversations with the designers?
I think they need as a minimum someone in their team, and it may actually be their regulatory compliance expert that knows enough about these standards to firstly appreciate they apply and they are mandatory. Secondly, to have at least a conceptual idea of the amount of rigour that's required to achieve compliance so that you then don't get sticker shock when you see the bill for doing this stuff. For example, to comply with IEC 62304, within our standards quality system process, we produce 30 or 40 different documentary artefacts of evidence of that, running typically to thousands of pages of documentation. It sounds very daunting, but it is what it is.
30 or 40 documents, 1,000 each, or 1,000 in total?
Thousands of pages total within those documents. And they are called up by IEC 62304 as being required. And one thing I didn't mention about ISO 13485, it requires you to have documented procedures for doing all of this stuff. You just can't go off and do it and generate the results. You need to have documented procedures under your quality system about how you go about doing it.
So you can't just make a change, you've got to...
It does become quite rigorous. So there is a big overhead burden. And that's why, obviously we have a vested interest in saying this, but we actually say to any entrepreneur, really seriously consider, do you want to establish all that in-house in your own resources? Or would you prefer to have sufficient budget to be able to engage with experts who have all of this in place? They have it, they know how to use it, they've proven it works, and they can just deliver the result.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on then.
Usability 62366, I won't claim to be an absolute expert on this particular standard, but nevertheless, it is a formal process for making sure that your medical device usability minimises the risk that the users will screw it up, to put it crudely. So you're building into the user interface and the actual design of the device from a usability perspective, facilities that minimise the risk of misuse. And there's a formal process that's been identified for achieving that. It's defined by the standard. I will make a comment. Be thankful these standards exist, because the regulators, in particular the FDA, have their own set of assessment guidelines that are very rigorous, and they'll be assessing you against all of these things. If you have followed these standards, you have a fairly high degree of assurance that you will then pass that scrutiny. If you don't follow these standards, then good luck.
Okay.
I don't know if we have time to run through this, Tim. I'll leave it at your discretion about whether we start to go through any of the key detail points, or whether we just...
Yeah, I think we might run through the rest of these slides in just very lightly, but I just remind everyone to start typing your questions in the Q&A icon on your questions panel. So when we get to the end, we can ask Geoff some questions.
So these are really just some key touch points that if you follow these or place emphasis on these, and refer to the appropriate sections of 60601-1, then you'll be fairly well served in achieving compliance. So these are probably the key touch points that are areas where designers may fall down in achieving compliance with those standards.
Yeah. Okay.
Electromagnetic compatibility, this applies to non-medical devices as well. And I can guarantee that if you don't follow good guidelines in your designs, you'll be non-compliant. Conversely, I can say if you do follow good design practice, you have a very high chance that your designs will pass electromagnetic compatibility compliance on the first pass. Probably the biggest takeaway is the bolded item down the bottom. Don't just design something and submit it to a test lab and hope it's going to pass. Make sure you've done sufficient testing, either in-house with your own facilities or engage with a test lab to do informal, non-binding pre-compliance testing to make sure that when you submit to formal compliance testing, you will pass. Otherwise, you're paying an extremely expensive process, multiple iterations that you can do and deal with informally at a much lower cost. Software, the key touch points, have a well-defined process and have coding standards and defensive programming techniques. So essentially best practice approach to software engineering will serve you well in complying for medical. Software requirements, be careful not to mix system and usability requirements with the software requirements. The software implements what is required as a requirement, but it's not a software requirement in its own right. Architecture, we mentioned before, but it should follow naturally the hardware architecture. So if you've got a sound hardware architecture, your software architecture should follow from that. And the other dot points down below, just a few approaches. Weeks of coding can save hours of planning, and you can adopt agile methodology to medical device development, but it is inherently fraught. The agile approach doesn't marry well with the rigours called up by IC 6304.
So just in case no one's had their coffee this morning, clearly planning is key to save you, spending weeks of coding and experimentation by coding rather than really.
Software engineers love to rip in and start doing application coding work. It's the very first thing they do. We have an in-house gated process for software development with about 20 steps in it, and I think the 18th step is to start writing the application.
Yeah.
The application code can be considered probably the least important part of the whole software
and this
process.
Really cuts to the heart of this, minimum viable product. Would you just get out there, do a proof of concept, rip into the code, get something, show that it works, and then worry about it all later. But it's really, for medical devices, it sort of leads you towards a path of, starting off with bad practices is not going to get you to where you want to be.
Yeah. I mean, it's a little bit like starting to designing a car by designing the steering wheel and the dashboard.
Yeah.
As the first part, whereas the application software is the steering wheel and the dashboard, and all the rest of the car is the under the hood stuff that you have to have right for the dashboard and the steering wheel to be of any use.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll wrap up there. Again, just encourage you to type in any questions using that Q&A panel. If you'd like a copy of these slides, just send an email to Geoff Sizer, and he'll send you a copy of the slides back. There was a lot of dense text in there, and we will be repeating this webinar sort of probably periodically, once a year or so, and we'll try and get some more pictures in there for the next one. But so apologies for that. But I'll just encourage you all now to start typing your questions so that we can ask Geoff some questions. Just for those of you who joined late, my name is Tim Canagita. I'm the coordinator of the New South Wales Active MedTech community. My contact details are there in the bottom right-hand corner. If you want to get more involved with the community or have any questions, you can also contact me. So I'd just like to start off, Geoff, by asking you a question about the speed. Because you mentioned that it took sort of 6 to 9 months, and further months after that, once you get to the clinical trials and things that have to happen afterwards. Why does it take so long, and is there anything you can do to make it go faster? Because one of the things I hear all the time is when people come in and they say, look, can we do it in 3 months? What would it take? What's your answer to that?
Well, there are some things that simply take time that you really have difficulty compressing. So going from a specification to a sound circuit schematic, you can take the approach of having multiple people involved, but you then add to the net cost because you lose efficiency. So assuming you have one lead designer and maybe a couple of other people participating. It's just takes a certain amount of time to do the work. Similarly with a circuit board layout, that's typically done by one person and it simply takes the time it takes. In parallel with that, you can be developing your software. So probably the biggest chunk of time is that circuit schematic and circuit board layout work. Pre to that, you have to do the requirements capture and get all the stakeholders to sign that off. So it can be quite burdensome just getting everyone in agreement that the requirements meet the need. Then the other big chunk of work at the far end is the verification and validation testing. And I'm not talking about switching your circuit board on and making sure the LED flashes. I'm talking about absolutely intensively and rigorously testing every circuit module. Do the serial interfaces function with the appropriate clock and data rise and fall times? Are the logic levels correct? Are the functional aspects correct? Are the voltage supply rails correct? Can the voltages deliver the required current with some margin? Etc., etc., etc. So just a lot of detailed, rigorous work that simply takes time for the engineers to do.
Yeah, it's great hearing those kind of things because, as I said earlier, you can, with the electronics hidden, it can be really taken for granted that, how hard can it be just to design one of these? But all those little things, those examples you gave, I think a key message here is that, it's not that hard, but it just needs to be done in a rigorous manner and it takes time.
Yeah, so it's not that hard if you know how.
Yeah.
It's hellishly difficult if you don't.
Okay, so I've got quite a long question here, which I'll read out. For a startup company working with an engineering design company on an active medical device with electronics and software, what are the important in-house staffing requirements for the startup company to ensure that the project objectives are met? And how do the in-house staffing requirements change as the project matures towards regulatory approval?
I mentioned the term being an informed buyer. So having someone on your staff that can have a meaningful conversation with all of your subcontract suppliers, if you are going to outsource those, is critical. Obviously, any work you're doing in-house, you need to have the expertise on staff. But certainly having some technical expertise that can have meaningful conversations with all the third parties you're dealing with. You definitely need to have clinical expertise and medical expertise accessible to you, if not on staff, certainly in the group of stakeholders who can really provide that medical level input to the device. So in the early days, you also definitely need to have regulatory compliance knowledge so you know what you're facing. So as time goes by, in the mid stages, you probably need to bolster the regulatory side in preparation for the final compliance processes. You might like to start to think about how you're going to set your quality system up. So you might need resources in that domain. And in the electronics and software side, making sure that the expertise available to you can continue to have meaningful dialogue with assuming you're having subcontractors involved as suppliers. When you're getting to the far end, when you have to start thinking about having all of your documentation under configuration control, you have to think about all of the documentation you need to submit to the regulators, and also setting up your supply chain for manufacturing. You really need to bring in-house resources who can manage the logistics of that side. As a subcontract supplier, Genesys, I find it incredibly frustrating if the customer I'm serving doesn't have people on board that I can have meaningful dialogue on those points. So I end up personally backfilling a lot of that effort on behalf of the customer because they really just don't have the knowledge of doing their side of the equation. So I would definitely think about ramping up in terms towards the far end of the project, just the logistics management aspects.
So I know that that Genesys has at least one customer I know with an orthopedic surgery device. How many, and they've been working for about 3 years now. How many staff do they have? And are you able to sort of just rattle off some of the roles that they've got?
Well, they've ramped up, not in terms of full-time equivalents, because they do have some people as part-time consultants, but around 10 people. So they have the orthopedic surgeon who is the subject matter expert. They have a business manager who runs a business. They have an engineer who is core designer in the technology at the specification level, but doesn't do the electronics and software, but basically is the key expert in some of their core techniques that they're applying. They have 2 people involved in the logistics, a biomedical engineer and a person handling another qualified engineer.
Can you just clarify what you mean by logistics?
Handling the subcontract interfaces, getting things made.
So getting the plastics manufactured.
Putting things through their verification tests, preparing documentation compendiums to submit for FDA and CE approvals, preparing documentation for the quality manager, who's another person who's managing getting their quality system.
That's another person, the quality manager.
They also have someone who's an expert in the user interface and the logistics, who is managing that aspect and moving into their validation process of their user trials. So I've already mentioned 7 or 8
I think they've also got a risk manager as well, have they not? And a project manager.
And, well, they have now moved into the point of appointing a project manager, because they're now transitioning into their supply phase. So, and they had a part-time project manager during the development phase. So that's their in-house resources. That is supplemented by, in the case of Genesys, the electronics and software experts and managing all that side of things, industrial design company doing all the mechanical design and all the rigours on that side, and then an electronics manufacturer doing the manufacturing, a plastics manufacturer and assembly company in Taiwan, and a sterilisation, packaging and logistics company in Sydney. So probably 8 or 9 people in-house, and probably another 8 or 9 people who are experts in those subcontract suppliers. And this is for a not particularly complex active medical device, albeit for use in surgery, so it doesn't need to be sterile. So that adds some rigours.
Yeah. Okay. So next question here is, sorry, I've just got a few questions here. We'll go to the next one. What are the best practices for a startup company to manage a project completed by an engineering design company? That's kind of asking the same thing.
It's kind of the same thing from a slightly different angle, but from the management of the engineering design company, firstly, make sure that you have sufficient knowledge to be an informed buyer so that you can evaluate and trust the advice you're being given by the engineering company. I'm not saying that engineering companies will give you bad or self-serving advice, but it pays to be wary. You need to be able to understand what's being told. You need to establish a position of trust. There's no point in engaging with companies if you don't think you can trust them. So certainly establishing that trust, and a lot of that's just gut feel on an interpersonal level, but certainly do your due diligence to make sure that those companies that you're dealing with have a track record that you can rely upon, get cross referrals, get information from other parties so you can calibrate that extent. Then make sure that you typically may be engaging with several engineering design companies. Make sure that they talk to each other, have worked before, understand each other, and can contribute to a complete set of services, so you don't end up with any gaps where one party thinks the other party is responsible for that and it actually falls into a black hole. So getting that complete coverage. So I guess at the end of the day, it's making sure you have sufficient capability in-house to be confident that you can coordinate all of those inputs and trust the information you're receiving.
Great. Okay. We've got time for one more question, I think, and it's relating to clinical trials. At what stage will a pivotal clinical trial take place? Which tasks are completed in parallel to the clinical trials, and how this may affect the overall timeline of product development? Yeah. And just before you answer that, we can just talk about the difference, I guess, between clinical trials for, say, pharmaceuticals versus clinical trial for a medical device. And also, can you explain the validity of data that you are used, say, from a proof of concept through to a prototype, through to your final production-ready device? How does that relationship work?
And I'll step back even a bit further than that. There's a misnomer where people will refer to something as a clinical trial when they're really actually meaning a preclinical evaluation. In other words, they may have a proof of concept device or a rough and ready device that's been knocked together, and they'll get ethics approval from a hospital to do some preliminary trials on that with patients to see if the thing works. That is not a clinical trial. It's a preclinical evaluation. The clinical trial occurs with the validated device that has been approved effectively for much more rigorous clinical evaluation work in hospital, and it's a formal process in accordance with the plan. But it's usually done on a pre-production device. You must be absolutely clear to make that distinction. So in terms of what's done along the way, it's fairly normal to do pre-clinical evaluation work as a part of requirements to capture the requirements for the device. It needs to be done, as I said, with ethics committee approval. You can't just willy-nilly start testing devices on unknown suspects. But nevertheless, it is a relatively informal process. It is important to determine whether you're going to rely on outputs from that process purely as knowledge gathering, or if you are going to try and use that information as part of your final clinical submission. In the former case, you don't need to have necessarily demonstrated the veracity of the device before you do that trial. You can do it, but not rely on those outputs rather than information gathering. However, if you want that information to stand up as an input to your final clinical submission, you need to make sure the device you use has been developed under design control so that you can link the results back to what was the condition of the device you actually used. So it can get quite complicated. So to answer the question, in the pivotal clinical trial will typically occur after you have developed a device at least to engineering prototype stage and put it through design verification to show that it meets its requirements. So you can then rely on the fact that the device you are using in those pivotal clinical trials is representative of the final medical device. If it's not, then you can't necessarily claim that those clinical trial results have any validity, because you can't demonstrate what was the build status and software status of the device you used for them.
Okay. Look, I think we've run out of time now. It's just coming up on 1 o'clock, and we do like to try and keep the webinars to time. So actually, I'll just finish up, Geoff, because in this presentation, I heard the word daunting a lot of times, and I'm just a bit concerned that our audience here might be thinking, wow, if it's so daunting, do I really want to do this? How could you, is there any assurances you give to people that, hey, it's actually not that hard? Can you give us a positive spin on this to finish the webinar?
Well, I'll fall back to things that are daunting and difficult if you don't know how to do them. If you do know how to do them, they require rigour and they require a substantial amount of work, and some aspects are tedious, but they're not daunting, they're not high risk, and in many cases, they're not even difficult.
And that is what the purpose of this community is all about. We are, I guess, trying to demystify, the active MedTech development process, to educate our audience so that they are informed about what's involved, and that, the more you know, the less daunting it becomes. And so that's, I guess, a key aspect of the business. So
as one final thought, I have known engineers to say to me, oh, gee, that's really difficult. To which I say, well, be thankful, because if it wasn't, anyone could do it.
Yeah, and I guess that translates through to the viability of your product in the marketplace, is that, the more difficult it is to do, the harder it is to replicate, I guess, and therefore, you're going to have a good business value proposition for your investors. So